Leap of Faith podcast fans. Welcome back to this week's episode with yours truly, Randy Silver. We have part 2 this week. We have Evan Burk back on the podcast. Evan, welcome back.
Randy, thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to continue our discussion.
Awesome. So I'm going to say, if you haven't listened to the first part, which was the episode last week, please go back and listen to it. It's very important. Evan was on pod episode 97, where he talked about being a former NFL and D1 football coach. Through that episode, what did we talk about? And why is he back for episode part 2? He talked about growing up in Texas, going to Colorado for college, went back to Texas, able to get a job at SMU as a football assistant, turned into a grad assistant. From there, he was able to transfer himself after working at SMU football team a couple of years to the Miami Dolphins. There, he worked in various capacities, such as a video coordinator and with the special teams, among potentially other positions. And we got to a point, and I realized at the clock, we're an hour into the podcast. And I don't think you guys want to listen to us for 2 hours. As much as I want to talk for 2 hours with Evan, it was best to stop it there. So we talked about the very end, what it was like to work for the Dolphins, seeing what it was like to be in the NFL locker room, that feeling at wins, losses, the mindset that they have, the mindset of coaches. And we dove into mental health of coaches as well, the long hours that goes into them in season, off season, that people don't really think about. And so that was a really good stop. Now we're going to move into part 2. If you're listening on Apple, Spotify, any streaming service, thank you so much. If you go to YouTube, you'll see our beautiful faces, and you'll see the picture behind me, immersive background of Evan at UCLA. You'll probably recognize a couple of the players. I'll let Evan talk about that when we bring it back in. So we're going to talk about how he transferred from Miami to UCLA, getting out of the coaching scene a little bit, and what he does nowadays, which is a lot of speaking circuit, going to kids, helping them understand the correct mindset, how you have the correct characteristics to be successful, using learnings from coaching and then athletics and overall leadership to help you enable yourself. And with that comes a book they wrote. So we'll be able to dive into the book as well. So we got a full podcast ahead of you. Enough of me. Let's bring Evan back in. Evan, thank you so much for coming back.
Yeah, Randy, the first conversation was great. This immersive background is taking me back. I got my LA tan going on in this pic. So I'm excited to get started with you.
So I think that's a great follow-up, what I just talked about. I think we can dive in. So again, we're looking at you at the UCLA football team. Tell us about it. So tell us about what happened, how you went from the Dolphins to UCLA, and what it was like to work at the UCLA football team.
Yeah. Just to finish kind of continuing on my journey.
Yeah.
After I left after I left the Miami Dolphins, I ended up catching on at McMurry University, which is a school in West Texas, out of Abilene, Texas. I was there for 3 years. I was the recruiting coordinator there, the special teams coordinator, and the wide receivers coach. So had a lot of success within that program, coached a lot of very good players, and was fortunate enough to coach 3 All-Americans in the 3 years that I was there, due in large part to the great football players that we were coaching there at McMurry. After 3 years there, I had an opportunity. UCLA had reached out to me about an assistant position with working with the quarterbacks. And I'll just kind of take back real quick. In 2013, I spent spring break in LA. One of my good friends was coaching on the UCLA staff, and I went out to LA just to kind of hang out with him. He had a place and an extra room. So part of going out there was he was still kind of working. So during the days, I would kind of go off and do my own thing. But one of the days he set it up to where I could go in and interview Noel Mazzoni, who was the offensive coordinator at UCLA. So I had probably 3 pages of questions I wanted to ask him. And I go into the office and I walk into the room. Noel Mazzoni's in his office and he's like, "Hey man, yeah, I'm excited to chat with you." "Yeah, me too, coach." I pull out my notepad full of questions and he goes, "Hey, you work with Hal Mummy at McMurry?" "Yeah, coach, I do." He goes, "Hey, what do you guys do in the red zone when you're running his Y option concept?" And I was just like, "Oh, me? Oh, well, here, let me get up on the board." So I get up on the board. I start drawing up Y option. He goes, "Oh, yeah, that's really interesting. What do you guys do versus blitz? If they're going to blitz you in that situation, do you guys have a hot call or what?" I was like, oh, we'll see. Like, if we're going to get a blitz here, what we'll do is we'll tag the backside with a post or whatever. And so this like meeting for me to ask questions to Noah Mazzoni and interview him turned into him just asking me questions about the offense that we were running at McMurray that we had a lot of success with. And after about 45 minutes of him kind of just asking question after question about how we do things and how we call plays and how we do practice, he goes, okay, well, hey, this was great to meet you. And I got to run, but like, let's keep in touch. And he took off. And I remember, spring 2013, I was like, oh, this is such a bummer. Like, I wanted to ask, I had all these questions I wanted to ask him. I didn't get to ask one question. And I really, zero questions. Just me on the board, him like talking ball with me. And I remember being kind of defeated, like, oh, that kind of sucks. I really wanted to interview him and like ask him all these questions. And fast forward a year, this position comes open and my name comes up to work with the quarterbacks. And immediately Noah Mazzoni's like, oh, that guy that was here last year that worked with Hal Mummy. Oh yeah, 100%. Get that guy in here. So it was just kind of funny how I had that experience a year prior, just through like a connection I had. And I thought this kind of pseudo interview was like, kind of a waste of time, or that I really didn't get out of it what I thought I wanted to get out of it. But it turns out that turned out to be my interview. So sorry for that little tangent, but that's how I ended up getting to UCLA, and a really cool time to be at that program. This is going into the 2014 season. So this is early 2014. Joined UCLA and I was there for 2 years. And one of the things, I was working with the quarterbacks, and the quarterbacks were very good at UCLA at the time. In 2014, our starter was Brett Hundley, who ended up being a draft pick for the Green Bay Packers. He's still
played a
playing.
couple games.
Yeah, played a couple games, had some like actually really good starts. Has been in the league ever since then, and I think he just signed on with Baltimore for this upcoming season.
I think that's right. I think he's Jackson's backup.
Yep. Yeah, exactly. And he was a fantastic college quarterback. UCLA had a ton of success. We were 10-3. I think his junior year. And we finished in the top 10 for the first time in like 25 years. So a lot of success that first year that I was there. And then I got a chance to stay on and work with Josh Rosen his freshman year in 2015. And Josh Rosen had one of the most spectacular freshman seasons in a long time, especially for somebody who was a true freshman coming out of high school. And he ended up being a freshman All-American by, a host of different publications that rank freshman All-Americans. But it was just a really cool time to be there, obviously living in LA, working at UCLA, which is a phenomenal institution, and working with good people on that coaching staff, and working with really good players that were in that quarterback room.
Yeah, so I grew up in Southern California. I actually grew up a USC fan. So yeah, tough conversation, but it's all good. I appreciate California sports being good. So I have a couple of follow-up questions for you. One, after that meeting, I'm sure you maybe followed UCLA a little bit that following season before you joined. Did you see any of the concepts you talked about actually enacted by UCLA from what you put on the whiteboard?
So like in coaching, if you're not familiar, especially like football coaching, there's typically a lot of different trees that coaches come from, and they learn concepts, whether it's a defensive system or an offensive system. And you may not run that exact system that you learned underneath another coach, but you might take bits and parts of that system and implement it into a system that you create. So the person that I worked for at McMurray University, his name is Hal Mummy. And Hal Mummy is known as kind of like the godfather of the air raid offense. And for all the football fans out there, they're probably familiar with the air raid offense, probably around like Cliff Kingsbury and Mike Leach. But in the tree, so to speak, above each of them was Hal Mummy. Hal Mummy was the first one to kind of like run this system, and he is the godfather of the air raid offense. So there's a lot of air raid concepts really across college football and across professional football. And Noah Mazzoni, who was the offensive coordinator at UCLA, was somebody who had implemented certain schemes and concepts from the air raid into his offense. And Noel Mazzoni's offense was called like the end zone offense, which was basically like a zone read type of offense where the quarterbacks are reading a conflict defender. I'll stop here before I get into too much like football nerd talk. But essentially, he had basic concepts from the air raid in his offense, and I did see them implemented within that offense.
That's pretty cool. And you'd be like,
Yeah.
hey, that end zone blitz, that happened because of me. There you go. The backside post.
There you go. There you go. Yeah. And like different, it might just be like a small thing, right? Like in a certain concept on one team, a guy might be running across the field and the coaches might coach him to like sit down in the middle of the field for a certain reason, right? To either like draw safety towards him or to like strain the defense, so to speak. In other offenses, they might tell that same route, that same concept, just run through until you hit the other sideline, all the way on the other side of the field. And so it's like little nuances like that we were kind of like getting into when I was up on the board with Noel. So it was like, oh yeah, we would never tell him to sit down right here. We would always tell him to run to the other numbers and things like that. So they were very small and you probably wouldn't be able to pick them up if you didn't, have like an intense breadth of knowledge of kind of the offense and the plays that they were running.
Got it. That's cool. So then, that also means you went from the NFL to college. You started at SMU, went to the NFL, then back to college. What do you think was the biggest gap you saw from players going from college to NFL than people now that you say as you work with QBs coming out of high school, were coming from high school to college? Was it the physical aspect that they weren't ready, the mental aspect, or the total package altogether?
Oh, so let's clarify that real quick because I could go in 100 different directions. So are you saying like what is the difference in like talent level at each
I would say not talent level, more like the gap of readiness. Is the jump from college to NFL bigger than the jump from high school to college to get that player ready to be performing at the level that they're at?
Wow, very good question. I've never been asked that before. I would say that in a certain way, it is a very similar jump because when you're playing in high school, you're dominating most of the time if you're going to be a college player.
Yeah.
And now you're let's say a captain, you're all conference, and you go to college and now everybody is all conference, right? Like everybody was the captain of their high school team. Well, it's very similar when you go from college to the pros. Like in the pros, everybody was an all conference player. Everybody was like the best player at their position in their conference. And so I would say that it's very similar in that respect. However, the jump is a lot greater from college to the NFL. And also what dictates success at the NFL level is very different than what dictates success at the college level. A lot of times in high school, you can get by just being like the most talented player on the field. You don't necessarily have to be the hardest worker. You don't necessarily have to be a great leader or a great teammate. Like you could just be a physical specimen and like be a great high school player and get opportunities to go to college. When you make that next jump from college to the pros, those windows are kind of like the obviously the intensity in which teams evaluate you and look at you, that margin for error is a lot smaller. So, you have to have just like otherworldly talent for an NFL team in most cases to overlook personality defects, character defects, you not being a good teammate or being selfish. Versus in college, I think there's a lot more exceptions made and just because of the difference in competition. So it's like every level that you go up in competition level, like the difference shrinks. So to like just give a quick example, in high school, you might determine a receiver is open when there's like 2 or 3 yards between that receiver and the defensive back. That's open in high school. In college, that probably shrinks to like, half a yard, maybe a yard, depending on, the skill difference. In the NFL, like every defensive back is going to be literally like in the hip of a wide receiver, right? So like the margin of error in terms of like where you throw the ball as a quarterback or like what constitutes being open just shrinks.
Yep.
And so like that's the biggest difference that you can probably say in like all of the different levels, is that like each level you go up, like the margin of error and like what constitutes success gets smaller and smaller.
That's interesting. So there's a follow-up question to that. And then we can move forward. What was the name of the QB again? Just so everyone can hear it. Who was at UCLA who came in as a freshman?
Oh, Josh Rosen was the quarterback in 2015.
Yeah. For example, he was a QB, really good at UCLA, went to NFL, did not pan out the way he had hoped. And there's other reasons we probably could dive to. That's a whole different podcast. But the reason why I bring Josh Rosen back up is he came in and stepped in as a freshman QB. When you're evaluating talent coming from high school to college, are you able to tell this guy is ready to step in to be a college QB day one, or is it something that he proved himself on the field to be other people who've been in the program 3-4 years throughout the summer practice to earn that right?
So let me just start with that. It's never 100%, right? Okay. And anybody that tells you they can guarantee doesn't know what they're talking about or hasn't had enough mistakes in their career or is not being honest with you. Because I think that, yes, we can kind of like check all the boxes. We can have seen a lot of different things before, but there's certain elements that you really can't plan for and can't anticipate. Kind of to your point, like the situation dictates so much success in really in life in general. But I've done a lot of studying on this, particularly with NFL teams and NFL players. Like Patrick Mahomes is a great player, but if Patrick Mahomes has been on Cleveland or Detroit the last 4 years, like he is not an all-pro. He is not an MVP. He's not winning Super Bowls with the Detroit Lions. So like a lot of times, like the system you go into, the team affects a lot of that.
Yep.
So specifically with Josh, he came into UCLA. Josh is different. Josh was the most highly recruited player in the nation coming out of college, or excuse me, coming out of high school in 2014. So he was the number one quarterback recruit. He was without question the most talented quarterback I've ever worked with. Like, and I could tell day one spring camp as he came early to UCLA. So he should have actually been like in the last semester of his senior year in high school. And he was already on UCLA's campus going through spring ball. And it was unbelievable. I mean, it was really, really impressive. A lot about it was impressive. So like for Josh in particular, his size is very underrated. Here, this picture that we're looking at right now is his freshman year. And that's actually that spring that I'm referring to. So he's 18 years old. He should be a high school senior. And he's bigger than everybody in this picture. Yeah. He's bigger than every quarterback on that roster. So like, I think that's an underrated aspect of like Josh in particular. He's a big guy. He's 6'4", 210, very tough in terms of like taking hits and the ability to take hits and like getting back in the huddle, calling the next play. But his intelligence in terms of the way he saw the game was just at like a different level. So that's an example where he was so talented. He's the number one player in high school his senior year. Like, what is the competition like really for him, for someone as talented as him? And he played on the best team in the nation at Don Bosco in Manhattan Beach. And he was just like, it was evident from the moment he stepped on the field that like this guy is different. Now it's not always like that. Sometimes it can be, the certain player plays a certain style, has whatever athletic ability, can run the zone read, can do all these different things that like they might be a better fit. But talking about that kind of progression from high school to college, sometimes it just fits. But I will tell you in this case, like to step in from a high school senior to starting day one as a true freshman in the Pac-12 or any of the Power 5 conferences, you have to be literally out of this world special. And talent-wise, that was definitely Josh.
Now, the last question on here, and I promise to move forward. To take it to the other QBs who have been in the QB room for 3-4 years and they get beat up by a freshman, how do you as a coach help handle the emotions and the mindset that a 20, 21-year-old, 19-year-old is going through when they came to a school thinking they play and they're actually probably not going to get that chance?
And quarterback is very unique in this aspect, right? Like other positions, like running back, guys get subbed out. It's not a big deal. Like you can find roles for, the fourth wide receiver on the team. You can't do that at quarterback. Like only one guy is going to play. And, if you're a well-run organization, like you're going to roll with that. You're not going to be changing quarterbacks often.
Yeah.
So that is definitely a very difficult aspect. Now, like when we're in this room, like number one, like it's a meritocracy. Like we're not here to do anybody favors. We're not here to play the senior. Like, it's a meritocracy. We as coaches have to win. That's the name of the game. And that's why you came here. That's why you came to UCLA. So like whatever the result of the quarterback competition is, or whoever is under center, like within this room, we are all behind that one person, and we are all that one person. Right? Like I'm sure Josh would be the first to tell you that Jerry Neuheisel, who was the backup his freshman year, was very helpful to him in terms of learning the offense, like someone he can come to, in between series and talk to. So, it really does become kind of like this we before me mentality, and you have to really promote that within the room. So it's definitely a challenge, right? Because like the reality is I can sit here and tell you what the mentality should be or what we want to have in our room. But the actual reality of being that person who loses out on the starting job that has like wanted to be that starter for their entire life, that's a difficult thing to handle in the moment. But again, like we're all in this room together. So we want to be there to support Josh as the starter just as much as we want to be there to support Jerry as the backup and maybe not getting that starting role. And so you really have to build that within, not only within your team, but specifically within that quarterback room. You just always have to be communicating that to the guys. And as a coach and as a leader, you have to be leading by example too. We can't sit here and say that, hey, it's all about us in this room and then go out and make it all about yourself as a coach when you're on the practice field. It truly has to be aligned in terms of like what we talk about and the way we behave on a daily basis.
And then that goes back to what you're at SMU when you're talking about building that culture and build the culture around the team. But and then the other part of that is like you look at Alabama, Jalen Hurts, starter, lost his role, transferred to Oklahoma, and he's now the starting QB for the Eagles. So it doesn't mean to stay on the road. It's just you got to find a different option potentially, and that might mean you need to transfer. Which is why I'm going to segue to the next part is now take us to post UCLA. What happened moving forward as we can now segue to more into the post career of coaching, which is the speaking circuit and writing a book?
Yeah, sure thing. And, it was interesting because a lot of people, and I mean, where I was working with two of the best college quarterbacks the last 20, 25 years in college football. I had a lot of success. I obviously had built up my network and my reputation in coaching over, a decade plus. And I just had a moment, to be quite honest with you, at the very end of that 2015 season. It wasn't anything that happened. It was just like I had a moment where I had always taken notes in meetings, and like I have a huge note collection from every meeting I've ever been in because I was always planning on being a college football head coach. And one morning we all were filing into this meeting room, and I just had this like feeling that felt like it came from outer space and hit me between the eyes of like, wow, I don't want to go into this meeting room. And that feeling started to grow over the last few weeks of the 2015 season. And it was a feeling I had never had before. I had had failures. I had gone through adversity and challenges just like anybody else. But my North Star of being the head coach at the University of Colorado had kind of always pulled me out of whatever adversity I was going through. And it was definitely a case where I was not being pulled out of this kind of feeling of, I don't know if I want to do this anymore. And I think a lot of this too, Randy, you start looking down the road 12, 20 more years into the future, and like coaching never ends in terms of the instability of the profession, in terms of the intensity and like what you have to give up to be a successful coach. And like, going to be quite honest with you, if I was the head coach at San Diego State back in 2015 when all this was happening and I was making $850,000 a year, I probably would have been like, hey, Evan, you're making almost $1 million a year. like whatever feeling this is, don't lean into it. But when you're a young assistant and you're kind of at this point in your life, early 30s, like living in a great place, working for a great institution, but yet you're not fulfilled, it was something that I wanted to respect of that feeling that I was having and kind of lean into it and be like, okay, well, if I'm not happy now, when do I get happy? Like everything is aligned. Awesome. Here at UCLA, living in Santa Monica, everything you can imagine. But like, you know, I'm questioning what I'm doing. And I never had that before. So that was kind of like the impetus to like starting to consider like leaving coaching. At the end of that 2015 season, I did decide that like, okay, I'm not feeling like I want to coach anymore. And I also had this feeling that I could have a similar impact that I had on the field in other realms, in other areas, using the exact same skills, the same transferable abilities from my coaching career in other realms. Now, it was definitely a journey to kind of like discover that, but that was kind of like the reason why I left coaching, even though other people would look on the surface or just from afar and say like, wow, like how could you leave now?
Yeah,
like
exactly.
you're literally at like the precipice of like everything that you want to achieve in coaching. And, you know, it just was honestly having a very real conversation with myself and acknowledging those feelings that I was having. So that kind of led me in February 2016 to leave UCLA and start this path, as you mentioned, to kind of like doing the work that I do now of speaking and coaching.
Was the coaching staff at UCLA shocked that you put your resignation in?
I don't know if like shocked is like the correct term, right? Because like
they're so used to people coming and going per se.
It's so yes, I was going to say, you kind of like referenced it a moment ago when you were asking about the NFL. And like my first inclination when you were asking about like the difference between the two levels is like NFL, like you could be there one week, you could play on special teams, you could make a couple plays, but then like the next week we don't need you and we'll cut you and let some other team pick you up. And like, that's the reality of the business, especially at the professional level. And look, there were a lot of professional coaches on that UCLA staff. Like they've seen it before. They understand. But I think like those closest to me, especially those coaches on the offensive staff, I think they were surprised, but I didn't find this out till like a couple of years later, but I was talking with one of my buddies on that staff and, you know, kind of explaining to him what I was going through during that time. And he was just like, oh yeah, we knew. And I was like, oh, wait, what do you mean? And like, I had this mentality of like dominating everything I did. So like, oh, like making scouting report, dominating. Oh, okay. Like watching film, like dominating. And I'm sure as I was kind of like going through this moment, I was probably sitting there like, oh, I don't care anymore. Now, I wasn't like mailing it in. It was just that like they were used to me dominating, and then they could tell that like something had happened where like I wasn't at that level of intensity that I had brought for the 2 years previous. So, you know, I think it was just kind of interesting to hear their feedback. But I don't think when I did leave a couple of weeks later that they were like that surprised because they had kind of like seen this shift and probably knew something was happening.
Yeah. And that, honestly, that's just not your world. That's all business world. Like I can tell, and with people I manage, like, hey, your work quality used to be here. I'm seeing you drop down, or your attentiveness used to be here. It's dropping down. What's going on? Oh, it's fine. You know, something personal. Month, 2 or 3 months later go by. Hey, you know what? I'm actually going to leave. You know, I haven't really been happy. I've been interviewing other places. I found something different that fits me better. So you can definitely see when someone brings that and it comes down across all levels of walks of life. So it's interesting that they could tell that in your work as well.
Right. Yeah. And I took a lot of pride in everything that I did. And we talked about this in the first podcast. Like I didn't care whether I was passing out Chick-fil-A's or coaching an all conference player. Like my attitude and the effort that I brought was the exact same. And so, yeah, when you're used to seeing that every day and probably like getting your hair blown back a little bit by like my intensity, and then all of a sudden it's not there, it's probably pretty noticeable. So I could assume that goes for anybody in any walk of life.
Yeah, which then takes us to the walk of life that you chose after. And that's a good segue. Is I just changed the immersive background. If you can't see because you're listening, it's you speaking in front of, it looks like adults. And you have a slideshow going of Tom Coughlin, the coach of the Giants, when they won their championship in 2007 and 2011. So this is a good segue for Evan to kind of now talk about life post coaching and how you're able to reinvent yourself.
Yes, very cool. Great word, reinvent. I'm still doing, as I mentioned, Randy, like still a lot of the same things that I was doing before, but it's obviously in a different realm, and you have to like learn what that realm is and kind of like learn who you are as a speaker. Now that you're not on the football field, I will just acknowledge real quick for the audience that it was not transitioning out of football coaching from UCLA and then directly to booking speaking gigs and having corporate clients that I was coaching. This picture that you're seeing here, I think was shortly before the pandemic. So this was almost, 2.5 years ago. And like, it took a good 2.5, 3 years to get to this point. So I just like to highlight that because I know that especially now, a lot of people are going through their own kind of transitions or considering maybe defining a new North Star for themselves. And I just always like to encourage people that like, don't put the pressure on yourself that it has to be immediate and that you have to know exactly what you want to do. I started my own recruiting consulting to help athletes get recruited to college. I started that company when I left coaching. I did outside sales for a SaaS company for like a HR payroll company for almost a year. Didn't really care for that too much. I worked for another company, coaching athletic clients. And so like, all of these were experiences that were kind of on this highway still that were teaching me great skills and utilizing my skills. But it wasn't until maybe like 4 years ago that I kind of like started to stumble upon maybe my true calling, if it were. So this picture that you're showing here is yes, it's with corporate clients. This was for a keynote or a workshop that I had done. And like a lot of what I do, you were asking about like the actual transition. I've always seen lessons of leadership, lessons of peak performance, lessons of team building in terms of coaching through the lens of a coach and through sports. And so this is how I've always equated things, even from when I was a high schooler, captain of my high school football team and wrestling team. I've always been very passionate about this. And I think there's a lot of great lessons to learn. So even specifically this picture that we're talking about here, it's got Tom Coughlin, each of the years he won the Super Bowl. And what I was talking about in this picture was that here's Tom Coughlin, 2-time Super Bowl winner. It would be very easy for him to like stand in front of the team and say like, guys, I know what I'm talking about. Like, do what I tell you to do. And what the point I was making was that I think in like 2014, 2015, Tom Coughlin had started to feel like he was a little out of touch with the people that were on the team. Of course, they're 25 years old and he's 70 years old. And so what he had done is he had brought in a group that had done like an extensive research and case study on dealing with millennials and like managing millennials. And they presented to the New York Giants staff for a week, taught them how, hey, like what is the mindset of a millennial? Like, how do they communicate? What are they looking for in their jobs? And they use this to educate not only Tom Coughlin, but the entire coaching staff of like, hey guys, like I've noticed that I feel out of touch with the players. Like, let's have some people come in and teach us. And like, this is the common thing that you see in any great performer is like, regardless of what happened in the past, regardless of what success happened in the past, they're always trying to get better. Yeah. Tom Coughlin's not sitting there every day in front of the team, holding both of his Super Bowl trophies under his arm saying like, hey guys, whatever I tell you goes because we did this. 5 years ago, he's always evolving as a leader. He's always trying to become better in his role as a head coach. And that was the point I was trying to make here. And I think it goes for anybody, whether they're in, I say just like in a marketing role or in a sales role or in any corporate role. There are principles that really are true across boundaries. So I love telling those types of stories. I love kind of like sharing experiences from my career, like I've been sharing with you, in a way to help motivate people and also teach the skills that are necessary to kind of like continue to elevate your performance, regardless of what industry you're in.
I love that. I think that's a good point, is like, you see the average age of a coach, it's probably 50, 60, 70, and most people are 25, 30, 40 years younger in some cases. How do you get them to, one, trust you, believe in you, and then galvanize? And also, a lot of these people, especially in the NFL world, probably are coming from underprivileged environments. And you've been probably very privileged for 30, 40 years as a coach, made some money off of that. How do you understand what they're coming from and what they need? So it's interesting that he's able to see that and try to go ahead and create an environment for him and his coaching staff to get to the level of understanding to make them as a better organization, better culture, and winners.
Yeah. And, Tom Brady does this as well. Tom Brady's 45 years old. What does he have in common with a rookie that's coming into the NFL, right? Well, in a lot of the TikTok ways that he does. Yeah, TikTok, right? Yeah. But he's very good at being very human. He doesn't, even though he's the greatest football player of all time, he doesn't treat himself like he's the greatest football player of all time. And other guys can sense that. I've heard many stories of him going up to rookies and introducing himself. And like the rookies are like, yeah, I know who you are, of course. But the point is that like, he's the one going up to them. And he even talked about using the way that they motivate them, like understanding the millennials as a way for him to understand how to communicate better with the team. So not only is it like understanding the people that you lead, but it's also like utilizing what you learn in terms of like elevating your own performance in addition to the team's performance. So I love teaching, and obviously, we're talking about my coaching and my teaching or in my speaking. And this is what I use. I use a ton of stories from my career, from sports in general, as well as pulling from other sources. Right. But like, I'm the way I like to tell people is like, I'm a former NFL coach turned speaker, author, podcast host, right? And like everything that I do is really kind of like at the intersection of sports and leadership. It's not 100% relatable to every person or every audience, but a ton of it is relatable, especially for teams that are trying to be as high performing as they can or that exist in these competitive environments. And so my aim is not that everything that I'm teaching is 100% relatable. It's really sharing a different perspective on things to either help the audience grasp the concepts or maybe even just expand their mind as to like how other high performing teams operate and are built.
And how were you able to help teams high perform or still share the message you had throughout COVID? Because obviously where we're looking at you in person, was it just over Zoom calls, or were there other ways you're able to try to share the same message in a non-in-person format?
Yeah. So number one is I started my podcast when I was during COVID. So I've been doing that for maybe a year and a half now, and absolutely love, the name of my podcast is the highest level podcast. And the premise is kind of like examining how the best teams are built and what leadership excellence looks like at the highest levels. So everything is at the intersection of sports and leadership with that podcast. And it's been really enjoyable. It's been a great way to network with people and really like share their stories and learn from them. I like every guest that I have on, like I'm such a nerd, like even in real life, that these are the conversations I'd be having. Like if I was meeting these people for coffee, like I want to know what Greg Popovich was like when Taylor Jenkins, now head coach of the Memphis Grizzlies, is, a 23-year-old intern. Like I want to know like how he was treated. I want to know like, how they developed him as a coach, and like on and on and on. All these combos I would be having already. So it's been a great way to kind of like bring people along my learning journey as well. So that's one way. And then like obviously a lot of times like when you're not able to do it in person, and now that everybody is really familiar with using Zoom, that has become a huge part to presenting. Even like I'm doing a series here with SMU here in the fall, and we're presenting over Zoom. And I'm living in Dallas, and so like there's just certain things that just with the way that our society is kind of moving in terms of like presenting things like this, that it's a lot of it is presenting to Zoom, even if there is an opportunity to present in person. I will say this, as a speaker, as somebody who loves to speak and loves the energy that they get from the audience, it is rather difficult to present on Zoom versus in person, because like it's hard to tell like, okay, what's falling flat, like when do I need to like speed up and get to the next point, or when do I need to like really like dig into like a concept that people are really vibing on. So that is a little challenging, but hey, just like anything, you kind of like you take your notes after each workshop, each speaking event, and you kind of like adjust it accordingly. But obviously Zoom has become huge and since the pandemic.
Yeah, I think it's like you said, it's very easy nowadays to be over Zoom. Like the company I work for, Oyster, we're 100% remote. I've only met my coworkers one time at a conference to be able to be together. Other than that, everything's Zoom. All the clients we talk through Zoom. So I'm glad as society we can advance ourselves, and it's not like, hey, you have to be in person, have to be in person. I like being remote. As much as I'd love to meet with you in person, I think it would be great. I'm glad that we can do this over Zoom. Another way that you can also share and gather information is through reading, which takes us to your book, Finding Intangibles, written by Evan Burk, how to uncover the hidden traits that drive elite performers and championship teams. So tell us a little about the book and how you're able to spread the word.
Yeah, thank you for that. This is a book that is really kind of a culmination of my 20 years in coaching. And I was seeing throughout my coaching career that there were a lot of conversations when it comes to recruiting and team building that really centered around talent and what somebody can do on the football field. And I just had this feeling from even very early on when I was 22, 23, when I first joined SMU, that we were missing something when we're talking about each player. And that's something specific, was kind of like who they were as a person. What type of teammate are they? What type of work ethic do they have? What's their mindset or attitude like on a daily basis? And I felt these things were very important, but I wasn't seeing them really talked about. But as a 22, 23-year-old, you don't know any better, right? Like, I'm not going to raise my hand, first year at SMU and say, hey, can we talk about this guy's family and, the work ethic here? I wasn't in that position yet. But I think as I progressed through my career and I started to not only study the best coaches, like in college football and in the NFL in particular, but then also meet more coaches, and the coaches that I really thought were special, that were really great at recruiting and doing this, all thought very similarly. And they did not sit there and talk about a player's talent or how fast they were. I think the 40 time is the most overrated, useless piece of information in scouting for football. But like, don't even get me fired up on that, Randy, because I'll be here for the next 2 hours. But what they were describing to me were things like talking about like not only if they're a good teammate, but then I was asking follow-up questions about how they uncovered those things. And I had a couple of mentors and friends in coaching that were great in terms of educating me. When you go into a high school to recruit a high school kid, or do you just go talk to the high school coach? Because the high school coach benefits from being recruited by a Division I school. One of his players being recruited Division I. So what are they going to tell you? What does that mean? That means they're probably not going to tell you what's really happening. Who is going to tell you what's really happening? Well, sometimes you have to like read body language. You have to like read between the lines or hear what people aren't telling you. Or you go talk to other people, right? Like an academic coordinator probably is going to tell you exactly what he or she thinks. because they're dealing with that athlete on a probably close to daily basis. They see who that athlete truly is. And so I just became really passionate about these character traits, these intangible traits that you see time and time again show up on the really great teams and the really great players. And so it's really, the book Finding Intangibles is really about taking not a talent-based approach to recruiting and team building, but really taking a character-based approach to team building. And it's really a book about building a winning culture, or building the culture that you desire, without really specifically talking about building that winning culture. It kind of does it through defining these intangible traits that you want your team to represent. I'm sure you would agree, Randy, like teams that are successful in your industry and at Oyster, like you probably wouldn't just describe them as like the most talented. I'm sure they have a lot of intangible traits, such as like communicating at a high level, or collaboration, team chemistry, work ethic. There's a lot of things that actually dictate success, and they have very little to do with like the knowledge of somebody's software program coming into a job or a situation like that. So was always very passionate, and that's why I wrote the book Finding Intangibles.
And I think you hit the nail on the head, because when I interview people, I'm interviewing like 3-4 people a week. I don't even look at their stats. I don't even really care. It's the intangibles. Can you hold a conversation? Are you able to ask intelligent questions? Do you show teamwork? Do you show cohesiveness? Do you show the ability to want to strive to get better? Are you complacent? And I'm looking for the intangibles. If you can't fit those, then like I already know your resume is not going to be where I want it to be. So like that's the after effect. But I need to make sure you fit the team culture, because if one cancer, as we can see, can destroy a team, can destroy a locker room, can destroy everything.
Yeah, totally. And I talk in my book too about like establishing team fit and like understanding the culture fit on your team. And like you see sports team, and this is of course, going back to like, why do I use so many sports examples? Like we're all familiar, if we're like fans of teams, specifically like NBA and NFL, like it's very easy to relate, like, someone like Ben Simmons, incredibly talented, one of the most talented individuals on the planet in terms of basketball, but like doesn't, and of course we're just talking from afar, but like doesn't seem like a really great teammate.
Yeah.
Like just really kind of mailed it in on 2 different teams this year. And they're paying him a ton of money, right? He's got a $150 million contract, and he is talented in terms of just pure basketball, but like he doesn't have really a great attitude towards work ethic. He definitely doesn't have a great attitude towards sacrificing his own personal success and glory for the betterment of the team and to achieve team success. And like, that's what constitutes winning teams in NBA basketball. So you almost have to kind of like reverse engineer, like, what is it that dictates success in these environments? Now, yes, like LeBron James, even if LeBron James was a jerk, he's probably a really great player. But my comeback to that is that if he could still be a great player, but he wouldn't be realizing his potential. He wouldn't be experiencing personal excellence and personal growth on a yearly basis. And like, that's what separates like the really greats from like the truly like one of a kind Hall of Famers. That's what separates like the average players to good players. So it's not to say that you don't consider talent in the evaluation process. Actually, in my book, I talk, the first filter should be talent as a minimum requirement. Like, you need to have talent. But I talk in my book about the talent paradox. Talent is essential to success, but success is not determined by talent. In other words, like, you can have the talent and you can have success, but oftentimes someone's success is not dictated solely on that talent. It's all of these unseen, intangible traits that really help elevate people from what their talent level says they can do and achieve to, the truly great things that they can personally experience and achieve, both individually and on a team.
I would say 2 examples, if we take it to NFL, of 2 QBs. One, Jamarcus Russell, probably, I hate to use the term flop, but Raiders paid a lot of money for him. Nothing came out of it. And then 2, Heisman winner, Johnny Manziel, He talked about he did not have the right mindset while playing for the Browns. He thought the NFL was going to be as easy as college was. And when he got there, it was not. And, he never realized the potential he had. Same thing for me in the business sense at Oyster. I haven't experienced it here, but when I was at Cisco, I had many people who had the opportunity to be really good reps, but they did not put the work in to understand the technology they're trying to sell. They're not put the work in to reach out to the correct ecosystem around them to be successful. I saw other people who were not as talented or gifted in the way they could vocalize sales, but they put so much work and effort in, they got the results because they knew what they were doing to be successful.
Oh, 100%. And like, this is where it becomes difficult, is because when you're faced with like the prospect or you're recruiting somebody, it's like they've had all this success at their previous stops, but in your interview, you're not getting the sense that they have that type of resourcefulness or relentlessness, or maybe even like team attitude. It's very difficult when you're looking at like a highly touted prospect to like go away from that prospect and pick the other person who has all these intangible traits, but like they're not as outgoing, and like you're kind of questioning like, okay, well, do they really have what it takes to be like a top performing salesperson? And again, this is why understanding the minimum requirement for talent. So that way, if they do have the minimum requirement for talent, you can at least say and have the confidence in your own selection process to say like, okay, this other person is a 10 out of 10 talent wise, but I have so many questions about his or her intangibles. But like this other person, they might only be a 6 out of a 10 talent. And like, I just love their energy and I love talking to them and I want them to be a part of my team. And like, I want them to succeed. Like, that's a tough decision to make, but at least you know that the person with the less amount of talent has the talent to be successful. And then, that's where, the decision making comes in, and like understanding what your culture is. Like we can all, every team in the NBA on paper can benefit from adding Ben Simmons to their team. But like, is he going to actually be an addition, to their team? This is why you see a lot of times in sports, teams lose a talented player and they actually become better. I remember, I think it was the Denver Nuggets back 15 years ago. They had Carmelo Anthony, who was one of the top players in the league, but kind of selfish, kind of very, very me driven, very individual driven. And then like, once they traded him, they took off. I think they had a year where they were like the number 2 or number 1 seed in the Western Conference. And it was almost like an addition by subtraction. Yes, they're losing a very talented player, but like what they're gaining is like the team cohesion, like everybody being on the same page. And so I talk in my book about every time a team or a company makes a decision on bringing somebody new onto that team or into that locker room, you're telling everybody on the team what you're all about. And that's very difficult to kind of comprehend, because you're sitting there thinking, oh, well, like we need somebody to like play left tackle. And this guy's 6'7", 310 pounds. Yeah, that's true. Somebody is going to have to play left tackle. But if you go get a jerk or somebody who, right now Deshaun Watson's in the news because, he's being accused by all these women, like you're bringing basically somebody who's been accused of sexual assault or sexual misconduct by a host of people. And like, what does that say about you and your franchise?
Yeah.
Like he's definitely one of the best quarterbacks on the planet in terms of playing quarterback. But like, there's something wrong there on top of the fact that he's going to be wrecked mentally whenever he does come back. So I just believe fully in like that the intangibles need to be weighed significantly in the talent acquisition process. And you see this in the best sports teams, the Spurs, Alabama football, New England Patriots. These are teams that are never going to draft a Johnny Manziel or a Ben Simmons, right? Like they have a certain way that their culture is and that they want to win, and everything is aligned to how they want to play and how they want to win and the type of team that they want to be. And they don't deviate from that too often. Of course, there's deviations, right? Yeah. But like for the most part, those teams are 100% aligned. And those were the teams that I was like seeing in my career that I was like, oh, everybody, they're all doing this. Why is everybody else not doing this? And so again, it becomes tough because when you're the decision maker and you're looking at all that talent or the chance to add a Carmelo Anthony on your team, you think like, oh man, we need to go do this. But the best teams that win consistently don't do that. They never do that. So like, what does that tell you? And so basically this book is about how to prioritize character in your evaluation process and also make character a competitive advantage for your team.
And I think that's a great way, as we kind of hit close to the hour mark of this podcast, we can wrap it up right here and do a final summary. Evan, thank you so much for coming on today, because I think you really showed the great part about the end of the coaching, how you're able to segue that into helping coach businesses, companies, whatever it may be, in terms of person, over Zoom and books. I asked this question to all the people on the podcast. If there was one takeaway you wanted the Leap of Faith audience to have today in a high level 1 minute summary, what would that be, that takeaway for you?
I would say that I want people from my story and the stories that I was telling just over the last 2 hours podcasting, is just to take a process-driven approach to whatever it is that they're doing. I think a lot of times, especially in our society now, everything is results-driven. Mm-hmm. They're results-oriented. And there's certain realities, like if you're on a sales team, you have to hit certain numbers, you have to get those sales. But a lot of times the people that have success, they're not focusing on those numbers. They're focusing on the behaviors that are going to allow them to hit those numbers. And so I get asked all the time, how did you go from fourth grade football to the NFL in 6 years? And yes, I knew where I wanted to go, but it was also a relentless focus on what I was doing today and bringing a dominate mentality to whatever I was doing. And so I've just seen it time and time again, that process-driven approach to achieving success and not focusing so much on the results is what I would hope some people would take away from just my stories and maybe my story in particular.
Awesome. And what I would take away from is, I think it's the mindset. You have processed that mindset. You turned yourself from just a college kid into a college coach, into an NFL coach, now into a speaker helping enable other people's success. And it all comes from the driven mindset. And you can tell, I feel like you've kept the intensity maybe at like 20%. There's something in there, like if you put yourself on the football field again, it'll go wild. And it's all from the drive. And so wherever you are in your life, if you're unhappy, you're not where you want to be, maybe you're not getting that promotion, look at yourself, and yes, there's circumstances, maybe you deserved it, didn't happen, but are you in the right spot? Do you need to leave to take 2 steps back to go 4 steps forward? Are you putting as much effort in? Are you outworking everybody? You up the earliest, you stay in the latest. What are you doing to be successful? And if you see gaps where you can drive to be more successful, push yourself. Give yourself the extra kick and give yourself 3, 6, 12 months to do it. And you'll see the results. Maybe it's not every day. Maybe it's not going to be incremental, but when you drive, you'll see the results in either the achievements you want, or you'll see the results in yourself internally, the mindset, the physicality that you give yourself, and you have the will to do it, which will help you make more successful moving forward.
Very well said. I appreciate you sharing that. And yes, I 100% agree.
Awesome. Evan, if people want to find you, again, everything that he's talked about will be in the bio of YouTube and or the podcast. If people want to look you up, how can they find you?
Sure thing. I'm on all social media at Coach Evan Burk. Burk is spelled B-U-R-K. You can find me on my website, www.coachevanburk.com.
Perfect. Evan, thank you so much for coming on today. So we can go ahead and do the sign off. So please repeat after me. Stay healthy.
Stay healthy.
Stay wealthy.
Stay wealthy.
And have a good week, fans.
And have a good week.
Deuces.